Captain Jake Carter stood at the helm of the flagship Phoenix, the massive ship slicing through the void of space. His eyes were locked onto the screens before him, the stars flashing by as Earth's military forces made their final push against the Zygon Empire. The war had been long, and Earth had lost too many lives, too many friends. But today, they were on the brink of victory. The Zygon Empire, once a ruthless power that controlled entire star systems, was finally crumbling. Jake, however, wasn't one for celebrating victories before the battle was won. He focused on the tactical map, watching as his squadron of fighters moved into position above the battlefield. The Zygon fleet, though weakened, still posed a threat, and he wasn't about to let his guard down. The Phoenix's massive engines hummed as it moved through space, ready to join the assault. Jake's second-in-command, Lieutenant Harris, approached him with a serious look on his face. "Captain, the fleet's ready. The Zygons are retreating, but there's a report of a derelict enemy warship near the edge of the battlefield," Harris said, looking at Jake with a hint of curiosity. "Command wants us to investigate." Jake raised an eyebrow. The warship, once a symbol of Zygon power, was now just a floating husk drifting in the vast emptiness. It wasn't something that typically warranted investigation, but with the enemy in retreat, the mission seemed more like a formality. They needed to secure the area just in case there were any remaining threats. "Send a squadron." "I'll lead the team personally," Jake replied. He wasn't one to send his men into danger without being there himself. The Phoenix's small fighter ships detached from the mothership, quickly speeding toward the derelict ship. The Zygon warship had once been a marvel of technology, with sharp, angular edges and dark, imposing hulls. Now, it was nothing more than a graveyard, abandoned and silent. Jake's fighter ship flew into the darkened hangar bay of the warship, the docking clamps automatically pulling his vessel into place. He unstrapped himself and stepped out, his boots making a soft thud as they hit the cold metal floor. He felt a strange tension in the air. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "Stay sharp," Jake commanded over his comms. "We don't know what we're walking into." His team followed him as they moved through the abandoned halls of the Zygon ship. The walls were covered in strange, glowing symbols, their purpose unclear but ominous. The place felt dead, as though the crew had abandoned it in a hurry. There was no sign of Zygon soldiers, no bodies, just an eerie silence. They reached what appeared to be a storage area where crates of supplies were left unattended. But it was the figure in the corner of the room that caught Jake's attention. A small, slender figure, barely visible in the shadows. At first, Jake thought it was a mannequin or some kind of decoration, but then he saw the movement, a slight twitch of the wrist. He motioned for his squad to hold their positions. Stepping forward cautiously, Jake's boots scraped the floor, breaking the silence. He approached the figure, his hand reaching for his sidearm, but he froze when he got close enough to see the face. It was a woman. A young woman with striking features, pale skin, and long hair that cascaded around her face like liquid silver. She was dressed in a tattered uniform, her body thin, almost frail. Her eyes, wide and fearful, locked onto Jake's, and for a moment, they both just stared at each other in silence. Jake's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't Zygon. She was human, yet not human. There was something alien about her, but it was unmistakable. She looked like she had been through hell. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice softer than usual. The woman's eyes darted around nervously. She was trapped in the corner, her hands bound by metallic shackles. She looked like a prisoner, but her beauty was undeniable, even in such a disheveled state. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth to speak. I'm not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice cracking from what Jake could only assume was fear and hunger. "Please, help me." Jake motioned for his team to move forward, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. He was no stranger to war. He had seen countless horrors, but this was different. She was a prisoner of war, but her eyes held something else, something that Jake couldn't quite place. "You're safe now," Jake said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The warship was still full of dangers, and they hadn't even begun to search the rest of it. But for now, he couldn't leave her like this. "We'll get you out of here." The woman's eyes widened in disbelief, as though she couldn't believe someone would actually help her. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible. It was as if she had forgotten how to speak to another person. Jake ordered his team to start scanning the area for any remaining Zygon forces while he approached the woman. He knelt down to her level, trying to be gentle as he reached for the shackles binding her wrists. The metal was cold, and it took several tries to unlock them. As he did, she winced, her hands raw from the restraint. Once freed, she slowly stood, her legs trembling as though she hadn't used them in days or even weeks. Jake offered her his hand, which she took, though she didn't say a word. There was a sadness in her eyes, a story untold, and Jake couldn't help but wonder what she had endured. "We'll get you back to Earth," Jake said, trying to reassure her, though deep down he knew the journey would be far from simple. "Do you have a name?" The woman hesitated for a moment, her gaze lowering to the ground. Then, with a soft sigh, she spoke. "Sora," she said quietly. "My name is Sora." As Jake looked into her eyes, a strange feeling settled within him. The war might have been close to its end, but the journey ahead was far from over. The discovery of Sora and her connection to the Zygon Empire could complicate things in ways he wasn't prepared for. Still, one thing was certain. His world was about to change forever. "All right, Sora," Jake said, offering her a faint smile. "Let's get out of here." The rest of the team was already moving toward the exit, preparing to return to the Phoenix. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. This was more than just a rescue mission. This was the beginning of something far greater. As they left the Zygon warship behind, Jake couldn't help but glance at Sora. She was quiet, but there was a strength in her eyes, a strength that seemed to resonate with him. Whatever her past it was clear that the future would not be so simple for either of them. The battle for Earth may have been won, but the real fight, one of loyalty, power, and morality, was only just beginning. Captain Jake Carter couldn't shake the image of Sora's face from his mind as the Phoenix made its way back to Earth. The dark hull of the Zygon warship was now far behind them, but Sora's wide, fearful eyes haunted him. There was something about her that felt different. He had rescued prisoners before, but none of them had struck him like she had. Maybe it was her vulnerability, or the way her alien beauty seemed to radiate even through her obvious trauma. But whatever it was, Jake couldn't deny the connection he felt. Sora, for her part, remained quiet during the journey. She had said very little since they had rescued her, speaking only when spoken to, and even then, her answers were soft and distant. It was as though she had retreated into herself, unsure of who to trust. Jake understood why. She had been a prisoner of war, a slave of the Zygon Empire, and even though she was no longer shackled, she still carried the weight of her past. The journey back to Earth took several days, but Jake barely slept. He spent most of the time in the command center, reviewing the mission's success and the aftermath of the battle. The Zygon Empire had been dealt a heavy blow, but Jake knew that there were still remnants of their power scattered across the galaxy. The war was not over, not yet, but for now, Earth could breathe a little easier. When they finally arrived at Earth's orbital station, Jake was greeted by his superiors. General Walters, a stern, no-nonsense officer, and Commander Williams, his right-hand strategist, were waiting for him. Jake stood tall, his military uniform sharp, and his eyes focused ahead. Captain Carter, good to see you back, General Walters said, his voice gruff but filled with approval. Mission success? Yes, sir, Jake replied. The Zygon fleet is in full retreat and we've secured the area. There was an unexpected discovery, though. Walters raised an eyebrow. Unexpected? Jake's gaze shifted slightly. He wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. We found a Zygon prisoner on the derelict ship. She's different. Different? Commander Williams asked, stepping forward with interest. What do you mean? Jake hesitated for a moment, then motioned toward the corner where Sora stood. She was silent, watching them all with wary eyes. She hadn't said much to anyone since they'd left the warship, and Jake had made it a point to respect her space. But now, it was time to explain. This is Sora, Jake said. She's the daughter of a Zygon warlord. The room fell into a heavy silence. Both General Walters and Commander Williams exchanged surprised glances, and Jake could see the immediate concern in their eyes. The Zygon Empire had been a fierce enemy, and any tie to their leadership was not to be taken lightly. Warlord? General Walters asked, his voice sharp. Are you saying she's the daughter of someone high up in their chain of command? Yes, sir, Jake replied. She's been held captive by the Zygon forces, used as a slave. Walters didn't say anything for a moment. He crossed his arms and looked over at Sora. She was standing at the edge of the room, looking uncomfortable, under their gaze. We'll have to take her in for interrogation, Walters said finally. She may have valuable information about the Zygon war machine. Jake's gut tightened at the thought. He knew that Sora might have information, but he also knew that this wasn't just about her being a prisoner. There was more to her than they realized. She's not a typical prisoner, Jake said. I've been in contact with her, and she's different. She's not like the Zygon soldiers we've fought. She's been through a lot. Commander Williams frowned. Captain, I understand your attachment, but we need to prioritize the safety of Earth. We can't afford to have our emotions cloud our judgment. I'm not saying we should let her go free, Jake replied, his tone firm. But she's not a threat. She's a casualty of this war, just like we are. She deserves to be treated with respect. Walters looked at Jake for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. Fine. We'll keep her under guard, but she'll be questioned. For now, she's under your protection. Jake exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but it was a step in the right direction. He knew that the situation wasn't going to be easy, but he would do whatever it took to ensure that Sora wasn't treated like a mere pawn in the larger game of war. The days that followed were a whirlwind of debriefings and reports. The war was winding down, but there were still pockets of Zygon resistance to deal with. Jake was busy coordinating with military forces, ensuring that the final push would be effective. But through it all, his thoughts kept returning to Sora. She was kept in a secure part of the station, though Jake made sure she had her own quarters. He visited her whenever he could, though their conversations were always brief. Sora spoke little, still grappling with the trauma of her past. But Jake could see glimpses of the woman beneath the surface, the intelligence in her eyes, the way she held herself despite her situation. There was strength in her, and Jake couldn't help but admire it. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Jake found himself standing outside Sora's room. He hesitated before knocking softly on the door. He had no idea what he was going to say, but something inside him told him that he couldn't just ignore her. He couldn't let her slip away into the shadows of the war. The door opened slightly, and Sora's face appeared. She looked tired but curious. "Captain?" she said, her voice quiet. "Is something wrong?" Jake smiled, trying to ease the tension. "No, nothing's wrong. I just wanted to check on you. How are you feeling?" Sora stepped back, allowing him to enter. The room was simple but clean, with a bed against one wall and a small table. There were no windows, just the soft hum of the station's artificial lights. "I'm okay," Sora replied, though her voice was tinged with uncertainty. She looked down at her hands, still scarred from her time in captivity. Jake took a seat across from her, his eyes soft. "I know it's not easy, but I want you to know that you're safe here." Sora met his gaze, her expression a mixture of skepticism and hope. "Safe?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "I've never been safe. Not until now. Not until you found me." Jake was silent for a moment, his heart heavy. He didn't know how to fix what had been broken in her, but he was determined to try. "Earth might not be perfect," he said finally, "but it's a place where you can start over. You can choose your own path now. You don't have to be anyone's property." At his words, Sora's eyes softened, and she seemed to relax slightly. She looked down at her hands again, her fingers tracing the faint scars that marked her skin. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said quietly. "I've been owned, Captain. All my life, I've been owned by someone. And now, I don't know what freedom even means." Jake didn't have an answer for her, but he did know one thing. He would help her find it. Later that evening, Jake was summoned to a meeting with General Walters. As he entered the command room, he could sense the tension in the air. Walters and Commander Williams were already seated, their faces serious. "Captain," Walters began, "we've received orders from the higher-ups. They want to take control of the situation regarding Sora." Jake's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "They want her as a bargaining chip," Walters said, his tone grim. "Her father was one of the Zygon Empire's most influential leaders. They believe that by holding her, they can secure a peace deal." Jake's blood boiled. "You can't be serious. She's not some trophy to be traded." "We don't have a choice," Walters replied. "The higher-ups are already making plans. They believe Sora's lineage could be the key to ending this war once and for all." Jake's fists clenched. He had a decision to make. Follow orders or protect Sora, the one person who had suffered so much already. The weight of the decision was crushing, but Jake knew what he had to do. "I won't let her be used like that," Jake said firmly, his voice cold. "She's not a piece of property, she's a person, and she deserves to make her own choice." Walters didn't respond immediately, but Jake could see the conflict in his eyes. It wasn't the first time that morality had collided with duty in this war. But Jake knew that he had to stand firm, for Sora's sake and for his own. The battle for the future was only beginning, and Jake was about to face a war that had nothing to do with weapons or enemies. It was a war for a person's right to choose their destiny. Captain Jake Carter stood in the middle of the military briefing room, the lights above flickering as his mind raced. The conversation he had with General Walters earlier had been like a weight pressing down on him. The higher-ups were insistent. They wanted Sora, wanted to use her as a pawn in their diplomatic game with the Zygon Empire, but Jake wasn't sure he could just hand her over. She wasn't just some tool to be traded for peace. She was a person who had already suffered too much. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to clear his mind. The responsibility he now carried felt heavier than any weapon he had ever wielded. The stakes were high. Earth was on the brink of ending the war. But at what cost? What would it mean if Sora became a bargaining chip? Would she ever truly be free? The door to the briefing room opened, and Lieutenant Harris walked in, his usual confident stride faltering slightly when he saw the look on Jake's face. Harris had been with him through thick and thin, and though they didn't always agree on everything, Jake knew he could trust him. "Captain," Harris said softly, his voice filled with concern. "Are you all right?" Jake nodded but didn't say anything right away. He wasn't all right. He couldn't be, not when the life of someone who had been through so much was in his hands. "I don't know what to do, Harris." Jake confessed, finally breaking the silence. I'm being told to hand Sora over. They want to use her to end the war. I don't know if that's right. Harris sat down across from him, his brow furrowing. You're talking about an entire galaxy at war, Captain. It's not just about what's right for Sora. It's about what's right for Earth, for humanity. The higher-ups want this to end, and if Sora's the key... Well, you've got a tough decision to make. Jake clenched his fists, trying to hold back his frustration. I get that. I do. But Sora's not a bargaining chip. She's not something we can just trade to get what we want. She's suffered. Enough already. She deserves more than that. There was a long pause before Harris spoke again. I'm not saying it's easy, sir, but you've got to ask yourself, what's the greater good here? Can we afford to let personal feelings get in the way of the bigger picture? Jake stared at his reflection in the glass window that looked out over the station. The view of Earth below should have been beautiful, but all he could see were the shadows of doubt and fear that clouded his mind. I don't know anymore, Jake said quietly. I thought I did when I joined this fight, but now I'm not so sure. Later that evening, Jake walked through the corridors of the station, his boots echoing in the otherwise silent halls. His destination was clear, Sora's quarters. He had to speak to her. He needed to understand her side of this, what she thought about everything that was happening. Was she even ready for the responsibility that her lineage carried? Would she want to be the key to peace? Or would she rather disappear into the shadows of the galaxy forever? When Jake arrived at Sora's door, he hesitated for a moment. He had visited her before, but never like this. This time, things were different. The stakes had changed. The decisions they made now would shape the future of not just Earth, but the entire galaxy. He knocked softly on the door. After a brief pause, Sora's voice called from inside. Come in. Jake entered, finding Sora sitting by the window. The soft light of the station illuminated her delicate features, casting shadows on her face. She looked lost in thought, her gaze distant, as though she were contemplating something far away. Hey, Jake said gently, walking toward her. Mind if I sit? Sora didn't reply at first, but she nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the stars beyond. Jake took a seat beside her, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, Sora spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You've been quiet today. Jake sighed, unsure of how to start. I've been thinking a lot about you, Sora, about what's happening. Sora turned her head to look at him, her expression unreadable. What do you mean? The higher-ups want to use you, Jake said, his voice tight. They want to use your connection to the Zygon Empire to negotiate peace. They want to trade you like you're some kind of prize. Sora's eyes widened, and for the first time, Jake saw a flash of emotion cross her face. Anger, hurt, confusion. She turned her gaze back to the stars, her hands clasped tightly together. Thought as much, she said bitterly. They always want something from me. I've always been something to be used. Jake reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. No, Sora. You're not just a tool. You're not a thing. You're a person. Sora shook her head slowly. But that's all I've ever been to them, isn't it? I'm the daughter of a Zygon warlord. I'm a symbol of their power, their empire. Nothing more. I don't get to choose my fate. I never have. Jake's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine the pain of having your entire existence defined by the actions of others. Sora had never had the chance to live for herself, to carve out her own place in the galaxy. She had always been a pawn in someone else's game. You have a choice now, Jake said, his voice firm with resolve. You're free. You're not a slave anymore, and I'm not going to let them use you like that. Sora looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to read him. And what if they won't listen to you? What if they insist on using me? Jake didn't have an answer right away. He knew the higher-ups wouldn't back down easily, but he also knew that he couldn't just sit back and let Sora be used. Not after everything she had been through. "We'll find a way," Jake said. "Together." Sora let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly in her lap. "What if there is no way? What if they take me away from you and use me anyway?" Jake took a deep breath, trying to keep his own emotions in check. "Then we'll fight for you." "I'll fight for you." Sora turned her eyes back to the stars, a soft tear sliding down her cheek. "I don't know if I can ever truly be free." Jake stood up, walking over to the small table by the window. He needed to think. There had to be a way to keep Sora from being used as a pawn. They couldn't let her become a tool in a political game. She deserved more than that. The next few days were a blur of meetings, briefings, and constant pressure from Earth's higher command. Jake found himself constantly torn between his duty to his superiors and his loyalty to Sora. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was no easy answer. The political ramifications were enormous, and if he defied orders, there was a very real chance that he would be removed from his post, or worse, court-martialed. But every time Jake looked at Sora, he knew what he had to do. She had been through too much. She deserved a choice, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. One afternoon, Jake stood in front of General Walters' office, his mind racing with the weight of the decision before him. He had made up his mind. This wasn't just about the war anymore. It was about doing what was right, even if it meant going against orders. As Jake entered the office, General Walters looked up, his expression hard and unreadable. "Captain Carter," Walters said, his voice cold. "What is it?" "I need to speak with you about Sora," Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "What about her?" Walters asked, leaning back in his chair. Jake took a deep breath, his words clear and resolute. "I won't let you use her as a bargaining chip. She deserves more than that. She's a person, not a tool." Walter's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Carter. You don't understand the bigger picture here." "I understand." "Enough," Jake said. "I'm not going to let you turn her into something she's not. I won't be part of that." General Walters stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could feel the tension in the air. It was clear that this wasn't going to be easy, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He had made the right choice. The tension in Jake's chest hadn't lessened since his confrontation with General Walters. The decision to protect Sora, no matter the cost, had taken root within him, but with it came a heavy burden. It wasn't just about following his heart anymore. He knew that his actions had put him in direct opposition to the higher command, and that alone could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, even his future. Sora's presence on Earth was no longer just a personal matter. She had become a symbol, a piece of a much larger puzzle. Jake didn't regret his decision, but the weight of what lay ahead was beginning to feel unbearable. He had done everything he could to keep her safe. For days, Sora had remained in her quarters, a quiet figure who rarely ventured outside. The peace she sought in the solitude of her room was interrupted only by Jake's visits. Despite the calm of the station, Sora seemed like she was in turmoil. Her gaze often seemed distant, haunted by memories she wasn't willing to share. One evening, after another exhausting round of meetings, Jake found himself heading towards Sora's room once more. He knew she needed answers as much as he did. Something deep within him told him that there was more to Sora's story, more to her past than she had revealed so far. He knocked softly on the door. "Sora?" Jake's voice was gentle. "Can we talk?" A few moments later, the door slid open, and there she stood, her pale features soft under the dim light of the hallway. Her eyes were wide, but her expression was guarded, as though she were bracing herself for something. Jake could see that her walls were still up, but he was determined to break through them. I know you've been through a lot, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I understand if you're not ready to talk, but I think we need to. There's something important you haven't told me, and it's time you shared it. Sora hesitated, her gaze flickering between the door and Jake. For a long moment, it seemed as though she might shut him out, but then, as if she had made a decision, she stepped back and allowed him to enter. The room was dimly lit. The only sounds the quiet hum of the station's life support systems. A small bed, a table, and a few personal belongings were scattered about. It wasn't much, but it felt like Sora had made it her own corner of calm in a world that had never been kind to her. Jake sat at the edge of the table, waiting for her to speak. Sora, on the other hand, remained standing, her arms wrapped around, herself as though she were trying to protect something fragile. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I never wanted any of this. You have to understand that. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes softening. I know you didn't ask for any of this. Sora took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. My father. He was the one who started this war. The Zygon Empire wasn't always like this, you know. It wasn't always cruel and ruthless. But my father, he wanted power. He wanted to control everything, everyone. Jake frowned. He had suspected there was more to Sora's past, but hearing it from her made it feel so much more real. He became obsessed, Sora continued, her voice quivering. He believed that the Zygon people were destined to rule the galaxy, that they were superior to every other species, and he used me as a way to prove his worth. I was his pawn, his tool to negotiate with other planets, to broker alliances. I wasn't a daughter. I was a means to an end. Jake felt a sharp pang in his chest at her words. He had known that Sora's life had been hard, but he hadn't realized the extent of her suffering. To have been treated as nothing more than a tool, a bargaining chip, it was unfathomable. Why didn't you run? Jake asked, his voice gentle but full of curiosity. Sora's eyes flickered with sadness. I didn't have anywhere to go. My father had spies everywhere. He controlled everything. Even the slaves who served him were bound by blood oaths. I couldn't escape. Not then. Jake sat back in his chair, the weight of Sora's words sinking in. Her entire life had been controlled by a man who had seen her as nothing more than a tool. And even now, as she sat before him, she was still struggling with the aftermath of that reality. But now, Sora said quietly, almost to herself, I'm no longer his prisoner, and yet, I'm still trapped. The higher-ups want to use me as a weapon, just like he did. I don't know what to do anymore, Jake. I don't know who I am. Jake stood up and walked toward her, his heart aching for her. You're not a weapon. You're not anyone's pawn. You have the chance to make your own choices now, Sora. You have the chance to be free. Sora's eyes locked onto his. For the first time, she seemed to look at him not as a soldier, but as a person who might understand what she was going through. She didn't speak, but her expression softened, and Jake saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope that hadn't been there before. I want to believe that, Sora said softly. I do, but I don't know how. Jake stepped closer, his voice firm. I'll help you. We'll figure this out together. You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. Sora nodded slowly, but Jake could tell she still had doubts. The scars from her past were deep, and the pain she carried was something that couldn't be healed overnight. But for the first time, she seemed willing to try, to trust in the possibility of a future that didn't involve her being used or controlled. I don't know what's going to happen, Sora, Jake said, his tone gentle but resolute. But I promise you this. I won't let them use you. You have a choice now, and I'll fight for that. You deserve to choose your own path. Sora looked down at the floor, her fingers nervously tapping against her arm. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice tinged with uncertainty. What if they come for me? What if they don't let me go? Jake took her hand gently in his. Then we'll face it together. We'll fight for your freedom, no matter what it takes. You're not alone, Sora. There was a long pause before Sora finally lifted her gaze to meet his. A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Jake smiled back, feeling a warmth in his chest. For the first time, he believed that they might actually have a chance. They might have been facing impossible odds, but with Sora by his side, Jake knew they could make it through. As the days passed, Jake and Sora grew closer. She slowly began to open up to him, revealing more of her past, her pain, and her hopes for the future. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when Sora would retreat into herself, but Jake could see the change in her. She was beginning to understand that she had the power to shape her own destiny, no longer bound by the cruel hands of her father or the military's demands. But the storm was far from over. The higher-ups still wanted her, and the pressure on Jake to deliver Sora to them was mounting. The looming conflict between his duty and his growing feelings for Sora was becoming harder to ignore. But no matter what, Jake knew one thing. He would do whatever it took to protect her, even if it meant going up against the very people he had once sworn to serve. The days that followed felt like a tightrope walk for Captain Jake Carter. He could feel the pressure building with every passing hour. The higher-ups were growing impatient, and every time Jake crossed paths with General Walters, the tension was palpable. His superiors were adamant about using Sora as a diplomatic tool, and they expected Jake to comply. But Jake had made his decision, and there was no turning back. Sora had begun to open up more, sharing pieces of her painful past with him, but she still seemed uncertain about her future. She had spent most of her life under someone else's control, and the thought of true freedom was terrifying to her. Jake knew she was still wrestling with the weight of her past and the uncertainty of the future. But every time she smiled, even faintly, Jake could see a glimpse of hope in her eyes, a hope that she had long ago buried beneath layers of fear and sorrow. Jake knew they couldn't hide forever. The longer they stayed on Earth's station, the more likely it was that someone would come looking for Sora. His loyalty to her and his sense of duty as a soldier were pulling him in opposite directions. He had made his promise to her, but the growing pressure from Earth's military was becoming overwhelming. He knew that his superiors would stop at nothing to use her for their own gain, and if he didn't act soon, Sora would be taken from him, whether he liked it or not. Late one evening, after another exhausting round of meetings with military commanders, Jake stood on the observation deck of the station, staring out at the distant blue and green orb of Earth. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. The longer they stayed, the closer they were to being discovered. He turned around to see Lieutenant Harris standing just inside the doorway, his face tense and drawn. "You look like you've got something on your mind, Captain," Harris said, his tone measured. He knew Jake well enough to tell when something was bothering him. Jake exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the railing as he looked back out at the stars. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up, Harris. They're getting closer. The higher-ups won't stop until they have her, and I can't let that happen." Harris walked up beside him, glancing out the window before turning to meet Jake's gaze. "So, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time for us to leave." "It's time to go on the run," Jake said, his voice filled with resolve. "I can't keep playing by their rules. Sora deserves more than being treated like some kind of political asset." Harris didn't hesitate. "You're right. We're not going to win this one by just following orders. But it's not going to be easy. We'll need help." Jake nodded. He had already considered that. He had some allies, loyal soldiers who would be willing to help him if it meant protecting Sora and doing what was right, but he also knew that the consequences of their actions could be severe. They were about to break every rule in the book. Get the team together, Jake said quietly. We move fast and quiet. We'll get to the outer colonies where they won't be able to find us, at least not for a while. If we can make it out, we'll figure out the rest. Harris hesitated, but then nodded. Understood. I'll start gathering intel and contacts. But, Captain, are you sure about this? If we go through with this, there's no turning back. Jake's eyes hardened as he stared at the earth below. I've already made my choice, Harris. I'll do whatever it takes to protect Sora. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Jake had never been more focused, his every decision carefully calculated as he worked to gather supplies, secure transport, and make arrangements for their escape. He reached out to a few trusted allies, soldiers, pilots, and tech experts who had fought alongside him in the war. They had all been affected by the conflict, and many of them had grown disillusioned with the bureaucracy of the Earth military. They were ready to stand with Jake, even if it meant going rogue. Sora, for the most part, had stayed in her quarters, still processing everything that was happening around her. She hadn't been fully aware of Jake's plans yet, and he had kept things quiet to avoid drawing attention. But as the days passed, Jake knew he couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. One evening, after a long day of making arrangements, Jake found Sora sitting alone in the small garden area of the station. The soft glow of artificial light illuminated her pale face, and she looked peaceful, though there was still a trace of uncertainty in her eyes. She hadn't been able to fully escape the scars of her past, and Jake could see that the weight of everything was still pulling her down. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When she saw him, she looked up, her face softening ever so slightly. "Jake," she said quietly, as though she had been expecting him. He sat beside her, glancing around to make sure they were alone. The garden was one of the few places on the station that felt natural, an oasis of greenery in the cold, sterile surroundings of the military station. But even here in this small corner of peace, Jake couldn't escape the nagging sense of impending danger. "We need to talk," Jake said, his voice low but serious. Sora's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she sensed the gravity in his tone. "About what?" Jake took a deep breath before speaking, his words slow and deliberate. "I'm going to get you out of here, Sora. We can't stay. They'll come for you, and I won't let them take you." Sora's eyes widened, but she said nothing at first. Jake could see her struggling with the reality of what he was saying. "Jake, you can't just—" she began, but Jake interrupted gently. "I know it's risky. I know it's dangerous, but I'm not going to let them use you like that. You deserve to make your own choices, to live your own life. And I'm going to help you do that." Sora looked away, her expression torn. "But what about everything we've worked for? The war, the people who died. How can I just run away from that?" Jake's hand found hers, his grip firm but comforting. "It's not about running away, Sora. It's about doing what's right. You're not a tool and you're not a weapon. You deserve to live freely, and that's what I'm going to fight for." There was a long silence between them. Jake could see the fear in Sora's eyes, the fear of the unknown, of stepping into a future that seemed so uncertain. But he could also see something else, the faintest glimmer of hope. "You're not alone in this," Jake added softly. "I'll be with you every step of the way." Sora swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she squeezed his. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. I've been a prisoner for so long, Jake. How do I even begin to live on my own?" Jake smiled gently, his eyes soft. "One step at a time, and I'll be there, Sora. We'll figure it out together." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she nodded. "Okay, I trust you." The decision was made. They would leave, and they would leave soon. Jake's heart raced as he prepared to execute the most dangerous mission of his life. But as the hours passed, Jake realized that it wasn't just about saving Sora. It was about saving himself, too. He had lost so much to this war. His friends, his comrades, his sense of purpose. And in Sora, he saw a chance to rebuild what he had lost. The day of the escape arrived, and everything fell into place. Jake and his team had arranged for a small, untraceable transport ship to take them to the outer colonies, far from the reach of Earth's military. The plan was simple: get in, get out, and disappear. But as they prepared to board the ship, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead of them. They were about to step into the unknown, leaving behind everything they knew. There would be no going back. With Sora by his side, Jake knew one thing for sure. No matter what the future held, they would face it together. Jake stood at the edge of the hangar, the cold, metallic walls of the station surrounding him. He could feel the tension in the air, thick with anticipation. His heart beat loudly in his chest as he watched the transport ship being prepped by his small crew of trusted soldiers. Every detail had been carefully planned, but the feeling of uncertainty still lingered. This was it. There was no turning back now. Sora stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort, despite the chaos of the moment. She was still grappling with everything that had happened, but Jake could see the determination in her eyes. She was ready to leave this place behind, to escape from the life that had never been truly hers. They had made the decision together, and there was no hesitation in her now. "You sure about this?" Lieutenant Harris asked, his voice low as he approached Jake. He had been with him through countless battles, but this was different. This wasn't about military strategy. This was about survival. Jake nodded, his expression resolute. "We're doing the right thing. We don't have a choice anymore." Harris looked at him for a moment longer before nodding. "Understood. We're ready to go whenever you are, sir." Jake turned his gaze back to Sora, his eyes softening. "Are you ready?" Sora hesitated, but only for a moment. She had been through so much, and the idea of escaping everything she had ever known was terrifying. But there was also a sense of freedom in her now, a freedom she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. She had a chance to live for herself, to make her own decisions. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Let's go." Jake's heart swelled with pride at her words. They had come a long way from the fearful, broken woman he had first met. Sora had found her strength, and now it was time to use it. As the small transport ship lifted off the station, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had planned every detail, accounted for every possible threat, but the uneasy sense of impending danger still gnawed at him. He knew they were being watched. He could feel the eyes of the military on them, even if they hadn't acted yet. "Engines are steady, Captain," one of his crew members called from the cockpit. "We're clear for takeoff. No signs of pursuit." Jake nodded, but his instincts told him something wasn't right. He moved toward the rear of the ship, where Sora was seated, her hands resting in her lap. She looked calm, but Jake could see the subtle tension in her posture. She was still adjusting to this new life, this new freedom. They both were. "Hey," Jake said softly, sitting down next to her. "We're getting out of here. You've got a whole new world ahead of you." Sora smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. "I don't even know where to start," she said quietly. "It's all so overwhelming. But I think I want to try." Jake took her hand gently in his thumb brushing over her skin. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm with you, Sora. We'll figure it out together." Sora's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, she seemed at peace. "Thank you, Jake, for everything." Jake smiled back, but the weight of the situation hung heavily over them. As much as he wanted to believe that they were free, he knew the reality was much more complicated. Earth's military wouldn't let them go without a fight. The transport ship flew through the vast emptiness of space, heading toward the outer colonies. It was a long journey, but the farther they got from Earth, the safer they would be. At least, that's what Jake hoped. Hours later, the ship had reached the outer edge of the system, far beyond the reach of Earth's military. Jake allowed himself a moment to relax, though he knew the danger wasn't over. They still had to navigate through a maze of rogue factions and enemy forces who would stop at nothing to bring them back. Sora stood at the window, gazing out at the stars. The blackness of space stretched out before her, vast and unending. It was beautiful, in a way, but it was also terrifying. She had never known a life beyond the military's control, beyond the cruelty of the Zygon Empire. The freedom she now had was both exhilarating and frightening. Jake approached her, standing quietly by her side. "You okay?" Sora turned to him, her eyes reflecting the light from the stars outside. "I don't know. It feels like I'm finally breathing for the first time." Jake smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You are. You've earned this, Sora." For a moment, they stood there in silence, watching the stars drift by. It was a brief moment of peace in a world that had always been chaotic and violent. But their peace didn't last. Suddenly, a warning light flashed on the control panel, breaking the silence. The ship shook, a deep rumble echoing through the walls. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he moved quickly to the cockpit. "What's happening?" Jake barked, his voice sharp with urgency. "We've got company," the pilot responded, his voice tense. "It's a military vessel. They've locked onto us. Looks like they're preparing to intercept." Jake's stomach dropped. He had known this moment would come, but he had hoped they'd have more time. The military was closing in, and they weren't going to let him get away so easily. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Jake ordered, his mind racing. "We're not giving up without a fight." The ship's engines roared as the pilot banked hard to the left, narrowly avoiding. The first volley of fire from the pursuing military ship. The sound of weapons fire shook the vessel, but Jake remained focused. He couldn't let them catch him, not now, not after everything they had been through. "Status?" Jake shouted. "We've lost one of the stabilizers," the pilot replied. "We're losing speed. They're closing in." Jake gritted his teeth. "Do what you can. We're not turning back now." He turned to the crew. "Harris, get to the weapons bay. We'll need all the firepower we've got. The rest of you, brace yourselves. It's about to get rough." As Harris and the others moved quickly to their positions, Jake's mind was on Sora. He needed to protect her. He couldn't lose her, not after everything they had fought for. But there was no time to explain what was happening. This was war, and they had no choice but to fight. The two ships danced through space, a deadly game of cat and mouse. The military vessel was faster, more advanced, but Jake's crew was relentless. They fought with everything they had, knowing that if they lost, they would be taken back, and Sora would be lost to them forever. The sound of gunfire echoed through the ship as the two vessels exchanged blows. The Phoenix's crew fought valiantly, but the odds were stacked against them. Every strike they landed on the enemy ship felt like a victory, but they knew it wouldn't be enough. "Captain," Harris's voice crackled over the comm, "we've got one more shot at this. If we can disable their engines, we might be able to escape." Jake didn't hesitate. "Do it. We're going all in." The final barrage of fire lit up the space between the two ships as Jake watched, heart in his throat. His crew had given it their all, and now it was up to luck. The enemy ship was badly damaged, its engines sputtering, but it was still moving, still coming after them. Then, in a final desperate move, the enemy ship veered off course, its trajectory wobbling as it spiraled into the void of space. It was a last-ditch effort, and it failed. The ship exploded in a burst of light and fire, its remains scattered across the stars. Jake and his crew exhaled collectively, the tension easing as the threat passed. The ship was damaged, but they had survived. For now. Sora came into the cockpit, her face pale but determined. "We did it," she said softly. Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with pride. "We did." As the stars stretched out before them, Jake and Sora knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long while, they were free. They had chosen their own fate, and they would face whatever came next together. The galaxy was vast, but so was their hope for a new beginning. And for Jake, that was all that mattered.